Hello everyone, and welcome to how best to use ERS on F1 2020 with some game file analysis. So I've been waiting a while to make this one then, because I wanted to make sure I had some experience on the game, because I wanted to make sure that everything I tell you guys today is going to be pretty much spot on and exactly how it should be. I didn't want to be feeding you guys information. I wanted to make sure that I was doing the right tests. So what we're going to see in this video then, well, first of all, we're going to go into the very basics of ERS, exactly what it is, exactly what it does, and then we're going to get into how it works on F1 2020 specifically. First of all, starting with the harvesting and then deployment, and after that we're going to get into the best use cases for the race, for the safety car, for qualifying, and also just for a pit stop. So let's get into it then. So first up is the basics. So ERS stands for the Energy Recovery System. It's basically the hybrid part of modern F1 cars. On F1 20, all the ERS systems are actually exactly the same. Every single car manufacturer has got identical ERS systems. The ERS system then consists of a 4 megajoules battery, an MGU-K and an MGU-H. First up then, the MGU-K. Now this is quite similar to the old style KERS which used to be on F1 cars a few years ago, and it basically both harvests and deploys electrical energy from the rear axle. It's got a maximum power output of 120 kilowatts. It's also got a maximum deployment of 4 megajoules per lap, which is actually the same capacity as the battery. It can also harvest up to 2 megajoules per lap, and it does that primarily under braking. Onto the MGU-H then, which is actually really quite complex and a really technical part of the engines in Formula 1. The MGU-H basically harvests excess energy from the turbo. So when the turbo is spinning up at really high speeds, when the engine doesn't need the full speed that it's spinning at, it will basically take the kinetic energy from that turbo and convert that into electrical energy and put it into the battery. It's also got a second use of keeping the turbo spinning at all times. Now this is based to reduce turbo lag, because in the old days, F1 cars used to have such crazy turbo lag, it made them really hard to drive. But actually, in modern F1 cars, this MGU-H keeps the turbo spinning at all times, so there isn't any turbo lag at all in a modern F1 car. Now the interesting thing about the MGU-H is that there's actually no limit at all to how much energy can be harvested from that turbo, so it's got unlimited potential. And the thinking behind that was that the manufacturers will then develop this MGU-H really heavily and make it super efficient. So how is this all displayed in the game then? So in the bottom right of the screen, you will see a little bit of OSD that basically displays the status of the ERS, or at least the bits that matter. So the first part of that is the ERS deployment mode. Now in the race, this is actually locked to medium, but outside of the race, you can often change it. So in practice, for example, you'll have access to all 4 modes. That is none, medium, hot lap, and overtake modes. In qualifying, you'll have access to just none and hot lap, and as I said, in the race, you'll only have access to medium. Just below that, you've got the battery status. This is literally the charge level of the battery within your car. So currently we're at 62%. Just beneath that again, you've got the MGU-K deployment limit per lap. Now remember before I mentioned you can deploy a maximum of 4 megajoules through your MGU-K per lap. Now this little bar represents how far you are through that usage. It can be deployed either through the ERS deployment mode. So you see there we're on the medium mode at the moment, so that would deploy some. Also if you switch it up to overtake, it will deploy much faster. Just to the right of that, we've got the bar that represents the MGU-K harvesting limit. Now, before I mentioned you can harvest up to 2 megajoules through the MGU-K when you're on the brakes, this bar represents that limit. And finally, there's your overtake button. Now, this is a button within the game that you'll have binded to your controller or to your wheel that you'll be able to very quickly switch up to a much higher deployment mode. Of course, it is mainly used for overtaking. Now, this button here just shows whether it's on, whether it's green, or whether it's orange and it's not on. Let's get in now then to how it works on F1 2020. First up, the MGU-H. Now for my tests, I've isolated only the MGU-H. So I've completely disabled the MGU-K. That's both harvesting and deployment. So the only thing active right now is the MGU-H harvesting into the battery. So the MGU-H basically harvests whatever throttle you aren't using. So if you're at 100% throttle, it's not harvesting anything at all. If you're at 0% throttle, it's harvesting 100%. If you're at 50% throttle, it's harvesting 50% roughly. So it's very much only dependent on the throttle. It makes no difference whatsoever what temperature your engine is, what revs you're at. None of that makes any difference whatsoever. So theoretically, lifting and coasting or perhaps going half throttle should help it charge a little bit quicker, but we'll get into the tests in just a moment. So interestingly, it only seems to charge when you're doing above 50 kilometers an hour. So when you're below that, doesn't matter what you do with the throttle, it will not charge at all. You have to do at least 50 kilometers an hour, and after that, then it's completely dependent on what your throttle position is. Interestingly, in the game files, it gives an efficiency for the MGU-H of 105%, so actually higher than 100% efficiency. Now, I assume this basically means that, say you're at 50% throttle, you're actually harvesting maybe, 52.5% of your MGU-H, so it's actually slightly better to be off throttle than it would be to be full throttle. So getting into the test then that I did only on the MGU-H, remember we've got it completely isolated, the MGU-K is completely disabled, we're not harvesting or deploying for anything other than the MGU-H. Now driving a normal lap, I found about a 29% gain into the battery per lap, so I started around 10% at the start of the lap, and at the end of the lap I was on 39% charge. After that test, I did a lift and coast test. So I said previously, it's completely dependent on the throttle position. So I thought, okay, what if I lift and coast before the corner? So maybe 50 to 100 meters before I would normally brake, I'm coming off the throttle and just coasting into the corner. So theoretically, I'm allowing the battery to charge a little bit more. And that proved to be the case because I actually gained 37% of charge. So again, I started on around about 10% and ended the lap with 37% more charge. So that's quite a big difference. That's an 8% difference in charge compared to normal driving. So clearly, for the MGU-H alone, lifting and coasting is really quite effective. Moving on to the MGU-K now. So once again, I've isolated only the MGU-K, so I've completely disabled any harvesting from the MGU-H, and I've also completely disabled any deployment from the MGU-K. So all we're doing is harvesting through the MGU-K. So the MGU-K harvests only on the brakes, so the more brakes you use, the more it harvests. It's a lot like the MGU-H in that it works on the throttle, but this just works on the brakes. Similarly to the MGU-H, you've also got a minimum speed of around 50 kilometers an hour in order to harvest anything at all through the MGU-K, so you need to be going at least that speed when you're on the brakes in order to recharge the battery. The efficiency, according to the game files of the MGU-K, is around 40%, so significantly lower than the MGU-H, which is around 105%, so really quite a lot less efficient is the MGU-K. Don't forget as well, you can only charge up to 50% of your battery charge per lap into the MGU-K, so you can only charge a maximum of 2 megajoules per lap. Once again, in the bottom right there, that white bar is the amount that you've harvested through the MGU-K, so that is limited, but in normal race conditions, you won't hit anywhere near that. Now, in a couple of little tests I've run, interestingly, I found that if you're both on the throttle and the brake, you are able to recharge your MGU-K. So that could be a potential thing that we could use perhaps under a safety car procedure, where we're on the throttle and on the brake in order to force the energy. So basically what you're doing is you're converting fuel directly from the engine, putting it through the engine and converting it straight into electrical energy to be used in the battery at a later stage. Another thing I found was that locked brakes don't actually seem to affect it, so you can have all 4 wheels locked up completely and you're still recharging, so clearly that's a game thing that wouldn't happen in real life, but that is an interesting thing to know. So on to my test then. So once again, I just did a completely normal lap. Let's not forget that we've got the MGU-K completely isolated. We're not deploying anything, we're also not harvesting anything at all through the MGU-H, we're only harvesting through the MGU-K, and I found that through a normal lap of Silverstone, I gained around about 25% of my charge into the battery per lap. As a little test, I tried some trail braking for this one. So once again, the MGU-K only recharges on the brake. So I tried to brake a little bit longer into the corners. So I just braked a little bit deeper than I would, just dragged on the brake very slightly through the corners that I'd normally be coasting. And I found it gave me a 26% gain into the battery per lap. So that's only 1% more than completely normal driving. So very, very small gains from trail braking there. Moving on now then to the deployment. So once again, I've completely isolated the deployment, so we're not recharging at all for either the MGU-H or the MGU-K. Now the first thing to note is that the deployment is completely based on the throttle use. So a lot like the MGU-H, it deploys completely on the throttle. It doesn't matter what revs you're doing, doesn't matter what temperature your engine in is, doesn't matter about any of that. It's all based on the throttle. There is a few modifiers to that, which we'll get into in just a moment, but it's completely based on the throttle. There's not really a lot you can do other than, the more throttle you use, the more it deploys. Simple as that. I thought perhaps that it would maybe only deploy for the last 20% of the throttle or something, so if you were quarter throttle it wouldn't be deploying at all, but that is not the case. It is very much a linear, so if you've got a 20% throttle, it'll be deploying at 20%. Interestingly then, the deployment only happens above 100 kilometers an hour. Now that's interesting because you can harvest above 50 kilometers an hour, but you can't deploy until you get above 100 kilometers an hour. So there's about a 50 kilometers an hour difference there between when it starts harvesting and when it starts deploying. Now, this is where it gets a bit more complicated the way it works in the game. There's basically 3 modifiers to the initial 120 kilowatts of maximum power that the MGU-K will deploy. And these modifiers stack onto each other. So let's say, 2 of them are at 100% and one's at 50%. That means the first 2 will be producing 120 kilowatts and the last one will maybe half that down to 60 kilowatts. Equally, if they're all at 50%, each stage would half the power. So the first stage would then half it down to 60 kilowatts, the next stage down to 30 kilowatts, and the next stage would then half it down to 15 kilowatts. They all stack on top of each other. Now the first modifier we're going to get into is the battery state of charge modifier. So when you're at 100% charge, you're deploying 100% of the possible 120 kilowatts of power. That applies right down to 10%, so you're deploying 100% of the power right down from 100% all the way down to 10% charge. Now once you get below 10% battery charge, that's when things get interesting and you stop deploying 100% of the power. So I've just put a few examples here that I've used these examples because this is what they are on the code, but they are softened between these examples, I should say. So here we got 7%. At 7% charge, it will deploy just 50% of your power. At 3% charge, it will deploy just 32% of your charge. And at 0% charge, or I guess 1% or 0.1%, because you need some charge to be able to deploy, it will deploy just 30% of your maximum MGU-K power. Now, once again, it is softened between these numbers, so it doesn't jump straight from 100% charge at 10% down to 50% at 7%. It does soften between those, so, 8% might be, I don't know, 70% charge, and 9% might be 90% charge, roughly. So it is nice and softened between these points. The second modifier for the MGU-K power deployment then is speed. Now, they have similar in real Formula 1, but it's probably not based on speed. I think in Formula 1 it's more based on GPS location throughout the track, so they program it to deploy at certain points throughout the track. But in F1 2020, it's based on speed. That's because they can just do that across all tracks. They don't need to program it for each track, so it's a lot more efficient way of doing it. Now, it doesn't deploy at all up to 100 kilometers an hour, which I mentioned previously. So there's 0% power up to 100%. And remember, this stacks across the others. So when this one's 0%, it isn't deploying at all, no matter what the other ones are deploying. Even if you've got 100% battery charge, if you're not at 100 kilometers an hour yet, you're deploying 0% power. So 0% of that 120 kilowatts. Now, it reaches 100% deployment power at 135 kilowatts. Once again, it is softened between those points, so it doesn't jump straight from 0% to 100% power. That would cause a lot of wheel spin. It is softened between them, so once again, say 120 kilometers an hour might be, I don't know, 65, 70% charge or so. Now, it actually stays at 100% power right up to 225 kilometers an hour, which is when it starts to peter out a little bit. So once we get to 255 kilometers an hour, we've gone down to 90% charge, 285, down to 60% charge, and then it does eventually completely stop deploying when you get to 330 kilometers an hour. So really quite a lot. And once again, it is softened between those points. So say 300 kilometers an hour might be, I don't know, 40% charge or so. Now, the final modifier is actually, well, it's sort of a combination of gear modifier and also the mode that you're in. So this is when that mode that we mentioned earlier, the mode that you set to deploy, this is when that comes in, but it's also combined with the gears. So obviously, when you're on the none mode, you're deploying 0% power in any gear. So once again, this will override any others. So you're producing no power whatsoever. You're not deploying anything at all when you're in the none mode. When you go up to the medium mode, you're producing a maximum of 30% of the maximum ERS-K power when you're in 4th, 5th, and 6th gear, that is. And you can see that no deployment at all in 1st gear, only 20% in 2nd gear, 25% in 3rd gear, 20% in 7th and 8th gears, maximum deployment of the medium at least in 4th, 5th, and 6th gears, which is going to be useful later on when we get into how best to use the ERS on F1 2020. Now, of course, you can also go up into hot lap mode when you're in qualifying. This produces 60% of the maximum power. And interestingly, that's from 2nd gear right through to 6th gear. But once again, once you get 7th and 8th gear, it does go down by 10%, down to 50% power. And of course, the overtake mode. Now, interestingly, the overtake mode is 0% in 1st gear, but after that, it's 100% power. So the overtake mode is the only mode that allows you to deploy all of the ERS-K power from 2nd gear onwards only, so nothing at all in 1st gear. And also, interestingly, in 7th and 8th gear, it allows you to produce full power, whereas the medium mode reduces the power output in 7th and 8th gear. Just before we get into the best use cases, I want to pause the video very quickly to ask you to please subscribe if you haven't already. If you're enjoying this video, please do press the red subscribe button down below. It does really help a channel of my size. We're approaching 30k subs as I'm making this, which is incredible. We need to keep the growth up, guys. Please do subscribe. Let's get back into it. Let's get into the best uses on F1 2020, starting with the race, which is, of course, where you'll care most about your ERS charge, because that's where you can, either overtake or gain the most, and that's also where it's the most critical to try and maintain a charge level. Now, the first test I did was a control test, so I basically, around Silverstone, got my charge down to around about 10% at the start of the lap, and didn't use any overtake throughout the course of the lap, just to see how much the car would naturally charge on a normal driving lap. So I drove completely normally, didn't try and do anything special, just drove what I would normally drive, just to see how much it would gain. Throughout this lap, I gained around about 10% charge, so that's the natural recharge rate around Silverstone. My next test was to try lifting and coasting, so this is of course backing off the throttle before you brake, so maybe 50 or 100 meters before I was going to brake anyway, I would completely come off the throttle and just let the car coast. Now, earlier on in the MGU-H isolated test, we found that we gained 8% extra charge per lap by lifting and coasting. So this is my first obvious test, and I was thinking, okay, sure, this is going to gain a load of charge, but actually, it didn't actually seem to help me at all. So I gained the same 10% charge throughout that lap, despite lifting and coasting, which was really surprising to me, because clearly MGU-H prefers to lift and coast. Now, I believe this is because you're actually shortening the braking zone, which of course is when you can regenerate through your ERS-K. So yes, okay, you're lifting off, you're regenerating a little bit through the ERS-H when you're lifting off, but then you're just shortening the braking zone, so you're reducing the amount you can generate through the ERS-K. So it's kind of 6 one, half dozen the other, really. Not deterred by that, I did a second lift and coast test where I was much more extreme with the lifting and coasting, so I backed off much earlier, and I really coasted a much further way down the straight, which does lose you more time. So the previous lift and coast test, I didn't really lose any lap time at all. This, I was losing about half a second a lap, but I just wanted to see if we could gain something. Now this did see a slight gain improvement, and we actually gained about 12% on the extreme lifting and coasting lap, which is quite a significant gain because that's an extra 20% of charge. So we've gone from 10% to 12%. That's a 20% increase in charge. So 2% doesn't sound like a lot, but you know, across 10 laps, you've just gained an extra 20% charge. It's actually quite a significant increase, but we did have to lose half a second a lap or so to gain that. My next test was to try trail braking. Now we tried this previously in the MGU-K isolated test and saw just a 1% gain per lap, but I thought I'd give it a go in race trim just to see if it made any difference, and sure enough it didn't seem to make any perceivable difference. We gained the same 10% in that lap, so just trailing on the brakes for a little bit longer throughout the corners didn't really seem to make any difference. With that said, I do believe trail braking would be very slightly beneficial to your charge level, but it's very minor. So for example, if you're coasting through a corner normally, if you just drag on the brakes very slightly, perhaps going very slightly hotter into that corner, and just drag the brakes very slightly, you are then allowing the ERS-K to generate a little bit more. Whereas if you're coasting, all you're doing is generating for the ERS-H, which, you know, okay, does generate some, but of course if you can generate for the ERS-K as well, that's going to be a little bit beneficial. But again, these gains are very minor, and honestly, unless you're sort of esports level, probably not worth it. My final test is a bit more extreme then, so we're going to try a half throttle test. So about halfway down the straight, we're going to go down to half throttle or so and just try and reduce the amount that we're deploying through the MGU-K, and then also allowing the MGU-H to harvest a little bit of energy. Now, of course, this does cost performance. In my test, I lost around about 6/10 a lap, and of course, you can do this to varying degrees, to varying performance losses or battery charge gains. But even though I lost 6/10 per lap, I did seem to gain 14% charge, which is quite a significant increase. Remember, the baseline is 10%. We gained 14%, so that's an extra 40% charge, extra 4% or 40% compared to our baseline charge per lap. So that's quite significant. Once again, across 10 laps, that'd be an extra 40% charge, so really quite a significant amount. So what is my advice then to maximize your ERS charge in normal race conditions? Now, interestingly, I didn't actually find any kind of special tricks. To be honest, creating this video, I thought I was going to find some really weird tricks that would really enable you to gain a load of charge. That is actually not the case at all. So for the most part, just race normally. That is the best way to gain charge. However, if you're particularly desperate for charge or you really do want to charge it, my first bit of advice to you would be to shift up to 7th a little bit earlier. Now, don't forget, in medium mode, you're deploying 30% of charge up in 4th, 5th and 6th, and then when you go up to 7th gear, you're actually deploying only 20% of your power. So there's a 10% reduction there in the amount you're deploying. Of course, this will not help you harvest any additional energy, but it will allow you to deploy a little bit less energy, which should theoretically allow your battery charge to go up a little bit. Now, if you're desperate to recharge your battery, if you're really down to 10% charge and you've got someone closing in on you and he's about to get on you and you really need that charge, then my advice to you would be actually to go half throttle down part of the straight. Now, once again, this is going to cost you performance. If you want every single 10th per lap, this is not for you. But if all you really care about is recharging that battery quickly, get halfway down the straight and then just ease off the throttle, of course, to varying degrees. The more you ease off, the less you deploy, and also the more you'll harvest for the MGU-H. So the more you lift off, the more battery charge you'll gain, but of course also the more performance you'll lose. So really, it's up to you how much you want to do that, but that is going to be your best way. You can also lift and coast, but that is less effective than going half throttle, so I would recommend using half throttle over lifting and coasting. Moving on now then to a safety car period. Now for me, this is actually a more important part of this video because during the race, ultimately, if you want to gain charge, you have to lose performance, which you may not want to do. But under safety car, you're losing performance anyway. You know, I found the safety car goes around about 15 seconds a lap slower than what you normally do. So you've already lost that performance. So with that performance loss, what is the best way to recharge your battery? So once again, I did a control test then, so I dropped 15 seconds off my pace around Silverstone, and I found I gained around about 44% of my charge. So it's actually quite a significant amount you gain anyway, just by backing off, because of course you're using the throttle less, so you're deploying less, and also then you're off the throttle more, so you're allowing the MGU-H to really deploy a lot more. Now, my first test was to try and effectively cheat the system. So what I did is I went full throttle, but then I used the brakes in order to try and generate some energy through the MGU-K. Now this wasn't very effective. I only gained about 39% charge across the lap, which is actually less than I gained through my control test. So that's 5% less gain. So do not do this. This does not seem to help. I think that's down to the efficiency. You know, I mentioned previously that the MGU-K is only 40% efficient, so you're just not efficiently using your energy that you've got within your car. My next test then was to try some lifting and coasting. Now we saw this was quite effective for the MGU-H, but not that effective in the race. Is it more effective in the safety car period? Well, the answer is basically no. I gained 45% by lifting and coasting quite heavily, so I was going full throttle at the start of the straight and then lifting off like half down the straight really, really early lift and coast, and I only gained an additional 1% of charge into the battery, so very, very ineffective lifting and coasting. Now, I believe this is because at the start of the straight, you're actually deploying more of your charge, so rather than, perhaps going at half throttle, you're deploying more charge at the start of the straight, so you're actually using up your battery, and then when you're lifting and coasting, yes, okay, sure, you are then allowing the MGU-H to recharge for longer, but then of course you've effectively got no braking zone at the end. You're reducing your braking zone vastly at the end, so the MGU-K is not allowed to deploy, so that's why there's very, very marginal gains for the lifting and coasting. My final test then was to go half throttle. So with this one, I was very, very cautious with the throttle. So, I mentioned in the race trim, your best bet is to go half throttle. So that is exactly what we did. We didn't actually go half throttle, but we did reduce it very, very heavily. So we were just treating the throttle pedal like it's got an egg underneath it. We were really, really cautious, just barely, just squeezing it and just barely matching a delta by just being as careful as we possibly could with the throttle pedal. And actually, that was really effective. We saw a 57% gain in our charge per lap by using this method. And again, we lost the same 15 seconds across the lap. And that's compared to the 44% that we gained when we drove normally. So an additional 13% charge per lap by doing this. So this is definitely the best way to go. This one is a complete no-brainer to me. Of course, you have to keep up with the delta, but just do that by being as careful as you possibly can with the throttle. And in fact, my advice in particular would be to never go above 80% throttle. So to summarise then, my advice under the safety car, be very, very cautious with the throttle. Just treat it like it's got an egg underneath it. Try not to go above 80% throttle at all. Also, shift very quickly between 3rd and 7th gear. So once again, we found when you're in that medium mode, you get maximum deployment in 4th, 5th and 6th gear. So try and avoid those gears as much as you possibly can. Again, you don't need the performance. So go from 3rd and then very quickly shift through the gears right up to 7th gear, which will allow you to deploy it a little bit less. Now, my final bit of advice, this one's quite extreme, so you probably won't want to do this very often, but if you're able to go it down to 1st gear in any corner, remember, 1st gear does not deploy any ERS at all, no matter what speed you're going. So what you want to do is get down to 1st gear and then actually put the throttle and the brake on at the same time, of course, without locking your wheels as much as possible. And that will force the energy to go through the ERS-K. And of course, this will be at the expense of fuel. So if you're marginal on fuel, do not do this. But if you've got plenty of fuel, if you're in 1st gear only, because that'll allow the ERS not to deploy, throttle and brake, and that will force energy to go through the ERS-K and force it into the battery, which will help you a little bit. Of course, it depends on the track. Something like Monaco, you can probably do this quite often, but something like, Silverstone, you can't do it very often. There's only kind of a corner or two that you can really do this, and it is quite aggressive. So, this is only if you're absolutely desperate and you really want to maximize every single % into your battery. Moving on to qualifying now then, my advice is quite brief for qualifying because of course you do have access to different ERS modes. So of course on your in-lap and your out-lap, make sure you're using the none deployment mode. So this ensures that your engine isn't deploying any of the energy power that you've got, and it allows you to just maximize the recharge. And of course when you're on the actual lap, make sure you switch up to hot lap mode because this will deploy all of the charge you're allowed to per lap. Now remember there's a maximum of 2 megajoules you can deploy across the course of a lap, and the hot lap mode will aim to deploy that entire 2 megajoules across the course of the lap. One final quick note on the pit lane then, so you do actually recharge quite significantly when you're in the pits. Now this is because you mainly use 1st gear in the pits and you're going below the 100 kilometers an hour, so you're not deploying anything at all, but you are able to harvest through the MGU-H. So make sure that you are depleting the battery nice and early when you get to the pit lane. Then when you hit the pit lane, you want to be on 10% or maybe even less charge, because then once you exit the pits, you'll probably be back up to, 40, 50, 60% charge. So it's effectively free energy there. Whereas if you're entering the pits with 80% charge, you're going to be at 100% charge half down the pit lane, and you're just wasting energy, you're just wasting performance. So there we go then guys, that is how best to use ERS on F1 2020. Hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little bit different for me. It took a long time to edit, to be honest. It took me about 10 hours or so to get this video together all in all. So if you did enjoy it, please do subscribe below and let me know if you want to see more of these style of videos. I could perhaps do some analysis on the engine or some of the tyres, whatever you want. So let me know what you want to see down below, and I thank you for watching. Bye bye.